The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as Brielle and Naomi Jones stood shoulder to shoulder before the judge. The twin sisters, both in their early 20s, gripped the defense table, their hearts thudding in unison. Their brown eyes scanned the crowded room, trying to stay calm despite the rising panic in their chests. Across the aisle, two smug police officers, Officer Bradley and Officer Wilkins, stood with relaxed postures and mocking smirks that told a chilling story. They thought they had already won. The officers leaned casually against the courtroom's wooden railing, their confidence palpable. Bradley whispered something to Wilkins and they both chuckled under their breath. It wasn't just a laugh, it was a message. You're powerless, and we control what happens next. Brielle and Naomi had never felt so humiliated. Just days ago, they had been living normal lives, volunteering at the youth center, working on their college coursework, and planning their future careers. Now they were being accused of possession of a controlled substance, with the officers insisting they found drugs in the sisters' car. But Brielle and Naomi knew the truth. The drugs had been planted. They had never seen that bag of powder until Officer Bradley triumphantly held it up during the search. They knew it was a setup, part of a larger pattern of targeting young black residents in Montgomery. Despite their clean records and stellar reputations, the officers had handcuffed them on the spot and dragged them to the station without a second thought. Now they stood in front of Judge Harrison, waiting to hear whether their nightmare would continue or if they'd be granted bail. Their attorney, Denise Harris, a fierce and determined woman with sharp eyes and an unwavering voice, stood beside them, ready to fight tooth and nail. She had already filed motions to have the charges dismissed, but she knew the odds weren't in their favor, not in a system where officers like Bradley and Wilkins often walked away unscathed. The courtroom fell silent as the judge adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the paperwork. His voice echoed across the room. Ms. Brielle and Ms. Naomi Jones, you are charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Denise said firmly, cutting through the tension. The judge nodded, flipping through the documents. Very well, we will proceed with the bail hearing. As the assistant district attorney stood to argue for a high bail amount, Bradley and Wilkins exchanged another smirk. They were sure the judge would side with them, just like he had countless times before. Brielle clenched her fists, biting back the burning words that begged to escape her lips. She could feel Naomi trembling beside her, though her twin kept her chin raised in defiance. These officers are lying, Brielle whispered, just loud enough for Denise to hear. They planted that bag in our car. We can't let them get away with this. Denise gave her a reassuring glance. Don't worry, we're going to expose the truth. But for now, all they could do was endure the humiliation. The assistant district attorney painted a grim picture for the judge. He described the sisters as a potential danger to the community, insisting that the drugs found in their car indicated involvement in a broader trafficking operation. The language was deliberately vague, just enough to make Brielle and Naomi look guilty without offering any real evidence. Given the seriousness of these charges, the prosecutor concluded, we believe a high bail is necessary to ensure the defendants appear at their next hearing. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling Denise to respond. She straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and measured. My clients are lifelong residents of Montgomery. They have no prior criminal record, and they are active members of the community. In fact, they were volunteering at the youth center just hours before their arrest. An arrest that was based on questionable evidence. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the judge to question the motives behind the officers' actions. Furthermore, Denise continued, we have documentation to prove their whereabouts before the arrest. There is no credible reason to believe they pose a flight risk or a danger to the community. We ask that the court release them on their own recognizance or set a reasonable bail. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering her argument. He glanced at the twins, his expression unreadable. Brielle held her breath, praying for a miracle. Bail is granted, the judge finally announced. However, given the nature of the charges, it will be set at $50,000. A collective sigh of relief escaped from the sisters and their parents, who sat in the back row, their faces etched with worry. The amount was high, but it was achievable with some financial maneuvering. "Thank you, Your Honor," Denise said, her tone polite but firm. As Brielle and Naomi turned to leave, they heard it again, soft, mocking laughter. They glanced back to see Bradley and Wilkins, their faces twisted in smug satisfaction. "See you soon, girls," Bradley muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with condescension. Brielle felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Her fists clenched at her sides as she fought to keep her composure. Naomi placed a calming hand on her arm. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We'll get through this." Brielle nodded, swallowing her fury. They had come too far to let their emotions get the best of them now. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as they bombarded the sisters with questions. "Do you deny the charges? Are you suggesting the police planted evidence? What's your next move?" Denise quickly stepped in, issuing a brief statement. "My clients maintain their innocence. We will be conducting our own investigation, and we are confident that the truth will come to light." The reporters pressed on, but Denise ushered the sisters into a waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away from the courthouse, Brielle stared out the window, her mind racing. "We can't let them win," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "We have to fight back." Naomi nodded, determination burning in her eyes. "We will." What neither of them knew was that their case had already caught the attention of someone much higher up, a team of investigators at the Department of Justice. While the sisters worried about their next steps, DOJ agents were quietly gathering evidence that would soon shake the entire foundation of the Montgomery Police Department. Back at home, Brielle and Naomi sat at the dining table with their parents, their dinner untouched. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of the courtroom still pressing down on them. Clarissa, their mother, kept wringing her hands, her worried eyes darting between her daughters. Across the table, their father, Marcus, leaned forward, his face lined with concern, but also a simmering anger he could barely contain. "I can't believe this is happening," Clarissa said, her voice trembling. "My girls, accused of something so awful." "It's not just an accusation," Marcus said through clenched teeth. "It's a setup. Those officers planted that evidence. I've seen it before and heard about it from friends at work. This is how they do it. Target our kids, claim they fit the description, and suddenly their lives are ruined." Brielle bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "We didn't do anything wrong. We were just volunteering at the youth center. How can they get away with this?" Naomi nodded, her voice low but steady. "They think they're untouchable. They laughed at us in court like we were nothing. Like this is all a game to them." Clarissa reached out and took their hands in hers. "You are not nothing, and we're going to fight this with everything we have. We'll prove the truth." Denise Harris sat across from them, her laptop open, typing furiously as she pulled together a strategy. "I've seen cases like this before," she said. "Corrupt officers plant evidence to pad their arrest records, knowing it's their word against yours. They rely on intimidation to make you fold. But that's not happening here." Naomi met her gaze, her voice firmer now. "So what do we do?" "First, we gather every piece of evidence to prove your innocence. Alibis, witness statements, security footage, anything that can undermine their story," Denise explained. "We'll also start digging into the officers' records. If they've done this before, we'll find it." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "And what about the Department of Justice? Should we reach out to them?" Denise paused, considering. "If the DOJ is already investigating this department, they'll contact us soon enough. But for now, we focus on building your defense. This isn't just about clearing your names, it's about exposing something bigger." The sisters exchanged a look, a quiet understanding passing between them. They knew this wasn't just their fight anymore. It was a fight for every person in their community who had been targeted and silenced. Over the next few days, the Jones household turned into a war room. Witness lists, timelines, and potential defense strategies covered the dining table. Brielle and Naomi worked tirelessly with Denise, retracing every step they took on the night of the arrest. They contacted the youth center director, who promised to provide attendance records and any security footage that might help. The sisters leaned on their tight-knit circle of friends, many of whom had witnessed their dedication at the youth center. Several offered to testify on their behalf, eager to help. But for every step forward, there was a new hurdle. On the third day, a cryptic message was left on the family's voicemail. The voice was low and distorted, almost robotic. "Drop the case," it said, "or things will get worse." Clarissa's hand shook as she replayed the message for Marcus. He paced the living room, running a hand over his face. "They're trying to scare us," he said. "Make us think we're alone in this, but we're not backing down." Denise filed a report with the local authorities and the DOJ, but the family remained on edge. At night, Marcus installed security cameras around the house, while Clarissa double-checked the locks on every door and window. Despite the fear gnawing at the edges of their resolve, Brielle and Naomi refused to let it consume them. They stuck to their routines, attending online classes, helping their mom cook dinner, and keeping up with volunteer work at the youth center. But the stares from people in the neighborhood were hard to ignore. Some friends and neighbors stood firmly by their side, offering words of support and encouragement. Others kept their distance, whispering behind their backs, clearly afraid to be associated with them. Brielle noticed it first while grocery shopping with her mom. Two women standing by the produce section whispered and glanced at her with pity in their eyes. "That's them," one woman said softly, not realizing Brielle could hear her. "The twins who got arrested." Her companion nodded. "Such a shame. You think they did it?" "I don't know," the first woman replied. "But you know how it is these days. It's hard to tell who's innocent and who's guilty." Brielle's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, pretending not to hear. Her mom placed a calming hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We know the truth," Clarissa said quietly. "That's all that matters." The whispers weren't limited to the grocery store. Even at the youth center, Brielle noticed some parents watching her and Naomi with thinly veiled suspicion. It hurt more than she cared to admit. "Why do they believe the worst so easily?" Naomi asked one night as they sat on their front porch. "We've spent years helping in this community, but one accusation, and suddenly we're criminals?" Brielle sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's easier for some people to believe the worst about us than to question the system." Naomi nodded. "But we're not going to let them define us. We'll prove them wrong." Their determination only grew stronger when Denise called with an update a few days later. "I've found something," she said, her voice crackling with excitement over the phone. "Bradley and Wilkins have been involved in at least 3 other cases where evidence was suspiciously found during traffic stops, cases that were quietly dismissed after complaints were filed." A chill ran down Brielle's spine. "So they've done this before?" "Looks like it," Denise replied. "I'm pulling court records and contacting those individuals to see if they're willing to testify. If we can establish a pattern, it'll destroy the officer's credibility and strengthen our case." Brielle hung up, her heart pounding. This was it, the crack in the wall they needed. But just as hope began to build, the sisters received another blow. They returned home one evening to find a typed note taped to their front door. "Back off or you'll regret it." Marcus ripped the note off the door, his eyes blazing with fury. "They're getting desperate," he said. "They know we're closing in on the truth." Clarissa hugged her daughters tightly. "No matter what happens, we stick together. We will not be intimidated." Brielle and Naomi nodded, their resolve hardening. They weren't just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting to expose a corrupt system that had wronged far too many. Little did they know, The DOJ had already taken notice. Agents were quietly gathering evidence, preparing to intervene. The storm that was about to hit the Montgomery Police Department would shake it to its very core. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Brielle and Naomi stood behind the defense table, their attorney Denise Harris flipping through her binder with calm precision. Across the aisle, officers Bradley and Wilkins leaned casually against their chairs, smirking at the twins, as though the outcome of the hearing was already decided. Brielle clenched her jaw, her eyes flicking to Naomi, who stood tall despite the knots tightening in her stomach. The courtroom, packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and supporters from the community, felt suffocating. Every eye was on them, waiting to see what would unfold. Judge Bernard Fulton entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him as he took his seat on the bench. He glanced at the case file before clearing his throat. "We're here today for a preliminary hearing in the case of State v. Jones. Counsel, you may proceed." The assistant district attorney rose first, his tone dripping with confidence. "Your Honor, the evidence against the defendants is clear. Officers Bradley and Wilkins acted lawfully in conducting a search that uncovered illegal narcotics. The prosecution believes there is sufficient cause to proceed with the trial." As he spoke, Brielle caught the smug glance that Wilkins shot toward his partner. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had promised Denise she wouldn't let her emotions get the best of her, not here, not in front of the judge. Denise stood, her voice measured but strong. "Your Honor, the defense vehemently disputes the prosecution's claims. We have compelling evidence to suggest that the search was not only unlawful, but that the officers planted the alleged narcotics in my client's vehicle. This isn't just a case of a misunderstanding, it's a deliberate act of misconduct." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Fulton raised an eyebrow. "Miss Harris, that's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support this claim?" Denise nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I have security footage from the youth center that confirms my client's whereabouts before their arrest, as well as sworn statements from multiple witnesses. Additionally, we've uncovered troubling patterns in the records of Officers Bradley and Wilkins, patterns of evidence tampering and racially motivated targeting that align with what happened to my clients." The assistant district attorney shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the officers, whose confident smirks had begun to fade. "Proceed," the judge said, his interest clearly piqued. Denise motioned toward the courtroom's projector. "Your Honor, I'd like to play a video captured at the youth center on the night of the arrest. It shows the defendants arriving at the center at 5:30 p.m. and leaving at 8:45 p.m. The police report claims they were seen engaging in suspicious behavior at the park at 8:30 p.m., an impossibility given their documented location." The lights dimmed as the video played. Brielle's heart pounded as the footage showed her and Naomi interacting with children at the center, the timestamp glowing brightly on the corner of the screen. When the lights came back on, the courtroom buzzed louder than before. "Your Honor," Denise said, "it's clear that the police report is not only inaccurate but fabricated, and it's not the first time these officers have submitted questionable evidence. I have here 3 additional complaints filed against Officers Bradley and Wilkins over the past 2 years, all alleging similar misconduct." She handed a thick folder to the court clerk, who passed it to Judge Fulton. He flipped through it, his expression hardening with each page. "Your Honor," Denise continued, "I'd also like to submit into evidence a series of text messages between Officers Bradley and Wilkins that were obtained through subpoena. These messages reveal their intent to target young black residents of Montgomery in order to boost their arrest statistics." The prosecutor leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, I must object to the inclusion of these messages. This is an attempt to smear the reputation of 2 decorated officers." "Overruled," Judge Fulton said firmly, his eyes now locked on the defense table. "I'll decide what's relevant." As the text messages were read aloud, gasps echoed through the courtroom. The casual, almost joking tone in the officer's words was sickening. "Bradley found a couple of troublemakers at the park might be a good stat boost. Wilkins's, perfect. Let's teach them a lesson they won't forget. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the words hanging in the air. Judge Fulton leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He tapped his pen on the desk before speaking. "Miss Harris, this is disturbing. I'll allow these records into evidence for further review. Does the prosecution have a rebuttal?" The assistant district attorney hesitated, glancing at the officers whose faces were now pale. "Your Honor, we request additional time to review these new materials before proceeding." Judge Fulton shook his head. "You've had ample time to build your case. Given the gravity of these allegations and the evidence presented, I'm inclined to question the legitimacy of this entire investigation." He turned to the defense. "Miss Harris, I assume you'll be filing a motion to dismiss?" Denise nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I'll be filing that immediately." "Very well," the judge said. "I'll review the motion and deliver my ruling within 24 hours. In the meantime, Officers Bradley and Wilkins are to remain on administrative leave pending further investigation." A ripple of relief coursed through Brielle and Naomi, but it was short-lived. As they turned to leave, Wilkins leaned toward Bradley, whispering just loud enough for Brielle to hear. "They got lucky today, but this isn't over." Brielle's blood ran cold. She felt Naomi's hand on her arm, grounding her. "Enjoy 'em," Naomi said quietly. "We've got truth on our side. They can't intimidate us anymore." Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters greeted them with cheers and applause. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust into their faces, shouting rapid-fire questions. Denise raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Today was a step toward justice," she said into the sea of cameras. "But this fight isn't over. We'll keep fighting until every lie is exposed and every person responsible is held accountable." Brielle and Naomi stood behind her, their faces calm but resolute. They had no intention of backing down, no matter what threats were whispered behind closed doors. Little did they know the Department of Justice was closer than ever to revealing the full extent of the corruption, and when it did, the entire Montgomery Police Department would be rocked to its core. The next morning, the air was thick with tension as Brielle and Naomi sat in their family's modest living room. Their parents hovered nearby, their father pacing with tightly crossed arms while their mother anxiously refreshed the news feed on her tablet. The judge's decision was expected at any moment, and the anticipation felt like a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. Denise's voice crackled through the speakerphone, steady but cautious. "I've just been informed that the judge will announce his ruling within the hour. I'll meet you at the courthouse." Naomi swallowed hard and looked at her sister. "This is it," she whispered. "Either we're free, or we're in for the fight of our lives." Brielle squeezed her hand. "No matter what happens, we've got each other. We always have." The family arrived at the courthouse to find it already buzzing with reporters and supporters. Signs reading "Justice for the Jones Sisters" and "End Police Corruption" waved above the crowd. A few protesters held opposing signs, their glares cold and unrelenting, but the overwhelming majority seemed to be on the twins' side. Inside, the courtroom was just as packed as it had been the day before. The atmosphere crackled with an electric tension as Judge Fulton took his seat. His expression was as stern as ever, but there was something different in his eyes, a spark of resolve that hadn't been there before. "The careful review of the evidence presented," he began, "the court determines that the charges against Brielle and Naomi Jones were based on questionable evidence and potential misconduct by Officers Bradley and Wilkins. This court cannot, in good conscience, allow this case to proceed." A collective gasp echoed through the room. "The motion to dismiss all charges is hereby granted," Judge Fulton continued, his voice firm. "Furthermore, I am referring this case to the Department of Justice for an independent investigation into the actions of the arresting officers." For a heartbeat, there was only stunned silence. Then applause erupted from the gallery. Supporters cheered and clapped, their voices rising in celebration. Brielle and Naomi stood frozen, unable to fully process the words until Denise leaned in and whispered, "It's over. You're free." Naomi let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Tears welled in her eyes as she hugged her sister tightly. Brielle's shoulders shook with emotion, her normally steady composure breaking under the weight of relief. Across the aisle, Officers Bradley and Wilkins sat rigid, their smirks wiped clean. For the first time, they looked genuinely worried. Their attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but it was clear they had lost control of the narrative. As Brielle and Naomi turned to leave, the officers stood and tried to make their way out through a side door, avoiding the growing crowd of reporters. But before they could escape, a federal agent stepped in front of them, badge raised. "Bradley and Wilkins," the agent said, his voice calm but commanding. "We need to have a word." The officers froze, their faces pale. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as cameras followed the unfolding scene. The agents led the officers away, and though they weren't in handcuffs yet, it was clear their days of impunity were over. Outside, the sun blazed down on the courthouse steps. Denise stepped to the podium flanked by the twins, their parents, and several community leaders. Reporters shouted questions, microphones waving in the air like restless hands. "Today's decision is a victory," Denise said, her voice firm but measured. "But it's not just a victory for Brielle and Naomi, it's a step toward accountability for all who have been wrongfully targeted and silenced. The fight isn't over. We'll continue pushing until every corrupt officer is held accountable and systemic change is achieved." Brielle took the microphone next. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "We've spent months living under a shadow of false accusations," she said, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "We were humiliated, terrified, and treated like criminals for something we didn't do. But today we reclaim our voices. We won't stop fighting, not for ourselves, but for every person who has been wrongfully accused, for every family who has been torn apart by lies. This isn't just about us, it's about justice for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing down the street. In the back of the crowd, a familiar face caught Naomi's attention. It was Carmen Lewis, their childhood friend who had recently returned to town. Carmen nodded at Naomi, her eyes glistening with tears of solidarity and pride. Later that evening, as the family gathered back at home, the gravity of the day began to sink in. The house was filled with laughter and relief, the dark cloud that had loomed over them for so long finally lifting. Denise sat with them, sipping a cup of coffee as she outlined the next steps. "The DOJ investigation is still in its early stages," she said, "but with today's ruling and the evidence we've gathered, I'm confident that Bradley and Wilkins will face serious consequences." Brielle nodded. "We're ready to testify. We want to make sure no one else goes through what we did." Her father, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke. "I'm proud of you both," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up for what's right. You refused to back down. And because of that, you've made a difference, not just for yourselves, but for this whole community." Naomi smiled through her tears. "We learned from the best." That night, for the first time in months, Brielle and Naomi slept soundly. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time they felt like they had a fighting chance. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of interviews, legal preparations, and unexpected support from the community. Brielle and Naomi became reluctant public figures, symbols of resilience in the face of a broken system. Every phone call, news headline, and whispered conversation seemed to carry a weight they weren't sure they were ready to bear. But deep down, they knew there was no turning back. Despite their newfound freedom, the battle was far from over. Denise warned them that the Department of Justice's investigation into the Hawthorne City Police Department could take months, maybe longer. Meanwhile, the officers who had wrongfully arrested them were still free, though they were under federal scrutiny. "We need to stay vigilant," Denise told them during a late-night strategy session. "They know the walls are closing in. When people like Bradley and Wilkins are cornered, they don't go down quietly." It didn't take long for the pushback to start. Strange cars began idling near the family's home late at night. Anonymous calls left cryptic messages on their answering machine, short bursts of static, followed by whispered threats. Once, Brielle caught a man in a hoodie taking pictures of their house from across the street before disappearing into the shadows. "Do you think it's them?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling as they stood at the window together. "Has to be," Brielle replied, her jaw tightening. "They're trying to scare us into silence." But instead of backing down, the sisters leaned into their growing network of allies. They attended community meetings, connecting with other families who had been affected by police misconduct. Each story they heard, each tale of false arrests, harassment, and intimidation only strengthened their resolve. At one meeting they met Marcus Jenkins, a local mechanic who had been arrested by Bradley 2 years earlier. He'd spent 6 months in jail after drugs were found in his shop, a setup eerily similar to the twins' case. "They've ruined my life," Marcus told them, his voice low but steady. "But seeing you two fight back, it gives me hope. Maybe it's not too late to set the record straight." Denise encouraged Marcus to speak to the DOJ investigators. Soon, more people began coming forward, young men and women, elderly neighbors, even a few former police officers who had grown tired of watching corruption fester unchecked. Each testimony became another piece of the puzzle, another brick in the case against Bradley, Wilkins, and the corrupt network they had built. The DOJ investigation gained momentum quickly. Federal agents interviewed dozens of witnesses, combed through case files, and cross-referenced evidence that had long been swept under the rug. What began as a simple inquiry into the twins' arrest soon blossomed into a full-scale probe into systemic corruption within the department. Late one evening, Naomi was sitting at the kitchen table when her phone buzzed. It was Denise. "You're not going to believe this," Denise said, her voice brimming with excitement. "The DOJ has just issued federal indictments against Bradley and Wilkins. They've uncovered a network of false arrests, planted evidence, and racial profiling that spans years. It's not just the two of them. There are at least 5 more officers under investigation." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. "So? They're finally going to face real consequences?" "Yes," Denise said, "and they're being taken into custody first thing in the morning." The next morning, news cameras surrounded the Hawthorne City Police Department as federal agents arrived to arrest Bradley and Wilkins. The officers were escorted out in handcuffs, their faces pale and drawn. Gone were the smug grins and confident swagger they had once displayed in court. Federal charges include civil rights violations, conspiracy, and falsifying evidence, the news anchor reported, her voice crackling through the living room television. This marks a significant turning point in the DOJ's investigation into corruption within the department. Brielle and Naomi watched the footage in stunned silence. Seeing their former tormentors led away in chains felt surreal, a moment they had dreamed of but never believed would actually happen. Their father clapped a hand on Brielle's shoulder. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up to them and you won." But the victory was bittersweet. For every step forward, there were reminders of how deep the damage ran. Friends who had once distanced themselves now tried to reconnect, offering apologies and excuses for their silence. Others doubled down on their skepticism, accusing the twins of exaggerating or playing the race card. "It's exhausting," Naomi admitted one night as she and Brielle sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "Sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, there's always going to be someone who doubts us." "I know," Brielle said softly. "But we're not doing this for them. We're doing it for the people who need to know it's possible to fight back." In the following weeks, the DOJ investigation continued to uncover shocking revelations. Internal memos revealed that senior officers had covered up multiple complaints against Bradley and Wilkins. Text messages between officers exposed a pattern of targeting young black men and women, often planting evidence to secure convictions. Agent Carla Ruiz, who was leading the investigation, met with the twins and their families to update them on the progress. "You've been instrumental in bringing all of this to light," Agent Ruiz said, her tone serious but warm. Without your courage, many of these cases would have remained buried. The weight of her words settled over them like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, Brielle and Naomi allowed themselves to feel proud, not just for surviving, but for making a difference. Despite the ongoing investigation, life slowly began to return to normal. The sisters went back to their college classes, resumed volunteering at the youth center, and even started planning a family vacation, a small act of defiance against the trauma they had endured. But they knew the fight wasn't over. Denise filed a civil lawsuit against the city on their behalf, seeking damages for emotional distress, lost opportunities, and legal fees. The lawsuit attracted even more media attention, turning the twins into national symbols of justice and resilience. Offers poured in, invites to speak at universities, partnerships with civil rights organizations, and even the possibility of a book deal. But through it all, Brielle and Naomi remained grounded. "We're not here to be famous," Brielle told a journalist during an interview. "We just want to make sure no one else goes through what we did." As the sisters walked through the streets of Hawthorne City, they noticed something different. Strangers smiled and nodded at them, offering words of encouragement. The same community that had once been divided now seemed united in its support. And though the scars of their ordeal would remain, they knew they had helped spark something bigger than themselves, a movement toward accountability and justice that would ripple far beyond their small town. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Brielle and Naomi prepared for their final hearing. It had been months since their arrest, months of investigation, intimidation, and painful truths. But this was the day they had been waiting for, the day they hoped their names would be cleared for good. Their attorney, Denise Parker, stood beside them, her expression calm and confident. She had prepared tirelessly for this moment, armed with undeniable evidence and an unshakable belief in their innocence. Across the courtroom, the assistant district attorney fidgeted with his papers. He no longer exuded the confidence he'd once carried. The weight of the federal investigation into the Hawthorne City Police Department had stripped away his arrogance, leaving him cautious and visibly unsettled. The judge, a stern-looking man with steel-gray hair, called the room to order. His sharp gaze swept across the courtroom before settling on the prosecution. "Proceed," he said, his voice firm but measured. The prosecutor cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor, given recent developments and new evidence provided by the Department of Justice, the state will not be pursuing these charges any further." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So you are moving to dismiss all charges?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor confirmed, his voice low. Denise smiled subtly, her eyes flashing with victory. She turned to Brielle and Naomi, giving them a reassuring nod. "Very well," the judge said, his gavel poised. "In light of the evidence presented and the ongoing federal investigation into the conduct of the arresting officers, all charges against Brielle and Naomi Caldwell are hereby dismissed. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Cheers erupted from the crowd of supporters who had filled the courtroom, their voices echoing through the chamber. Brielle and Naomi exchanged a look of relief, joy, and disbelief, all blending into one powerful moment. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes as she turned to hug Denise. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We couldn't have done this without you." Denise smiled warmly. "You didn't just survive this, you fought back. This is your victory." As they stepped out of the courthouse, a throng of reporters surrounded them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Denise spoke first, addressing the crowd with a firm but hopeful tone. "This is a victory for justice," she declared. "But it's also a reminder that the fight isn't over. There are still countless others who have been wronged by the same system. We will continue to push for accountability and reform." Naomi took the microphone next, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "We stand here today, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has ever been falsely accused or mistreated by those who swore to protect us. We won't stop until real change happens." Brielle followed, her eyes scanning the crowd. "We didn't ask for this fight, but we won't back down from it. We hope our story inspires others to stand up and speak out. No one should ever have to go through what we did." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a wave of support. Signs reading "Justice for the Caldwell Sisters" waved in the air, and the feeling of unity was palpable. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Brielle caught sight of two familiar figures, Bradley and Wilkins, being led into the courthouse in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents. Their smug expressions had been replaced by fear and resignation. For a brief moment, Brielle and Bradley locked eyes. He quickly looked away, his head bowing in defeat. The sight filled Brielle with a sense of poetic justice. "It's over," she whispered to Naomi. "They can't hurt us anymore." The aftermath of their exoneration was a whirlwind of interviews, public appearances, and offers from civil rights organizations. Brielle and Naomi became the faces of a growing movement for police accountability, their story inspiring protests and community meetings across the state. But despite their newfound platform, they remained grounded, focusing on the simple joys they had missed during their ordeal: late-night study sessions, volunteering at the youth center, and Sunday dinners with their parents. Agent Carla Ruiz from the DOJ paid them another visit, bringing news that the federal investigation had expanded even further. Several high-ranking officers in the Hawthorne City Police Department had been implicated in the corruption scandal, and sweeping reforms were already being implemented. "You helped make this happen," Agent Ruiz told them. "Your courage set off a chain reaction. This investigation wouldn't have gained traction without you." Brielle and Naomi nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "We just wanted the truth to come out," Naomi said. "We never thought it would get this big." "And that's exactly why it did," Ruiz replied with a smile. One evening, as the family sat on their porch, sipping sweet tea and watching the sunset, Naomi turned to Brielle with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if we hadn't fought back?" she asked. "All the time," Brielle admitted. "But then I remember how many people stood with us, people like Denise and Agent Ruiz, Marcus, and even strangers. It reminds me that we were never really alone." Naomi nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Brielle reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. "We have. And we're just getting started." In the weeks that followed, the sisters continued to speak out, using their story to push for broader reforms. Their civil lawsuit gained traction, with city officials quietly entering settlement negotiations to avoid a lengthy trial. Meanwhile, Bradley and Wilkins faced federal trials, their once promising careers reduced to rubble. The scars of their ordeal would remain, but they were no longer sources of pain. They became symbols of strength, reminders that even in the face of injustice, it was possible to rise above and emerge stronger. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the city as Brielle and Naomi stood on the courthouse steps once again. But this time it wasn't for a hearing or a court appearance. This time they were celebrating. It had been months since the charges against them were dismissed, and life had slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The federal investigation had grown into a national story, with news outlets uncovering deeper corruption within the Hawthorne City Police Department. Bradley and Wilkins, once so smug and untouchable, now faced multiple federal charges, including falsification of evidence, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. Their trial was set to begin in a matter of weeks, and legal experts predicted lengthy prison sentences. The Caldwell sisters had become a symbol of resilience and justice, their story inspiring countless others to speak out. Social media lit up with messages of solidarity and hope, and even national civil rights leaders reached out to offer their support. On this particular evening, the sisters stood before a crowd of supporters and media representatives gathered for a community event celebrating the reforms that had begun to take root in Hawthorne City. Local officials, under pressure from federal authorities and public outcry, had implemented sweeping changes: new leadership at the police department, stronger oversight committees, and expanded civil rights training for officers. Brielle adjusted the microphone at the podium, taking a deep breath as she looked out at the sea of faces. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice clear and steady. "When Naomi and I first found ourselves in that cold jail cell, we felt powerless. We were scared, confused, and unsure if anyone would believe us. But today, we stand here stronger because of the support we received from so many people: our family, our community, and those who refuse to let injustice go unanswered." The crowd applauded, and Brielle waited for the sound to die down before continuing. "Our story is just one of many," she said, her tone serious. "We were lucky. We had the resources, the legal help, and the courage to fight back. But there are so many others who don't have that. We can't forget about them. We have to keep fighting, not just for ourselves, but for every person who has been wrongfully accused or silenced." Naomi stepped up beside her, placing a supportive hand on her sister's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she added. "But if we stand together, if we refuse to back down, we can make a difference. We've already seen it start to happen here in Hawthorne City. Now it's up to us to make sure that momentum doesn't stop." A wave of applause washed over them, but the sisters were already looking ahead, to the work that still needed to be done, to the people who still needed a voice. In the months that followed, Brielle and Naomi threw themselves into advocacy work. They partnered with civil rights organizations, spoke at colleges and community forums, and even started a scholarship fund for young people pursuing careers in social justice. They were determined to turn their painful experience into something meaningful, something that could help others avoid the same fate. Their lawsuit against the city settled quietly but significantly. While the terms remained confidential, it was clear that the sisters had won more than just financial compensation. Their victory sent a message. The system could be held accountable, and those who abused their power would no longer do so with impunity. Meanwhile, Bradley and Wilkins had their day in court. The federal trial was swift and damning. Evidence piled up against them: text messages, fabricated reports, and even sworn testimonies from other officers who had finally come forward. Their once cocky demeanor had evaporated, replaced by hollow stares and desperate pleas for leniency. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Both men were sentenced to decades in federal prison, their badges forever tarnished by the stain of their corruption. One crisp autumn evening, Brielle and Naomi sat on the porch of their family home, sipping hot cocoa and watching the leaves drift lazily to the ground. It was a rare, quiet moment in their otherwise busy lives. "Do you ever think about how different things could have turned out?" Naomi asked, her voice thoughtful. "And occasionally," Victoria replied. "All the time," Brielle replied, staring into her mug. "But I also think about how far we've come. We could have stayed quiet. We could have given up. But we didn't. And because of that, we helped change things, not just for us, but for so many others." Naomi smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We didn't just survive this. We grew stronger because of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Naomi turned to her sister again. "What's next for us?" Brielle grinned. "Whatever we want. The future is ours." As the sun set on that chapter of their lives, Brielle and Naomi knew their fight wasn't over. Their story had become a beacon of hope, but it was also a reminder that the battle for justice and equality was far from complete. To everyone who heard their story, they offered this message: never be afraid to speak out. Never let fear silence you. The truth is powerful, and when good people stand together, there's nothing they can't overcome. Change starts with all of us, one voice, one story, one step at a time. If you were moved by Brielle and Naomi's journey, please share this story. Help spread the message that injustice must always be confronted and that courage and unity can create real change. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on hidden truths. Together we can build a better world, one story at a time.